Corla. Minister, I welcome the refreshing clarity that you're bringing to the answers that you're given here, and in fact the clarity that you brought to the question on the linkage between child benefit and school attendance was very useful, because we didn't get anything close to that from the Taoiseach yesterday. But my question to you is on the plans in the programme for government to tender out public school facilities for the use for after-school childcare by community and other organisations. So what I'm really concerned about is that I'm really delighted that there's public schools are being used for this purpose. I think it's absolutely essentially required, and particularly for people who are in work, parents who are in work, and lone parent families who are in work. But what I'm concerned about is the use of public schools for potentially private enterprise. And would you not, as Minister, be happier and better off looking towards a publicly funded model for publicly controlled childcare facilities? There are many problems with the private model, and I may come back to them after I hear some of your response, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Smith. I think I caught that was a lot of the core of what your question was about. Let me just begin by saying, though, in terms of initially to answer you, I think it's important to note that thousands of private providers currently deliver childcare through publicly funded childcare programs, including the Early Childhood Care and Education Scheme, the Training and Employment Childcare Scheme, and since February of this year, the Community Childcare Subvention Program. My department is also currently developing a single affordable childcare program that will enable any public investment in childcare, be it for preschool or school-age children, to be directed to families through communities, through community or private childcare providers. The program for government indicates, as you've outlined, that community groups and private providers will be invited to tender to use school facilities outside school hours for childcare purposes. And a cross-departmental group has now been established to consider how best to implement this commitment. Officials from my department and the Department of Education and Skills are developing a joint proposal for my consideration and the consideration of my colleague and Government Minister Richard Bruton. As part of this work, the group will assess, and I think this is also part of your question, the many issues surrounding the commitment, but also the funding implications of implementing an after-school scheme for school-aged children. And matters to be considered by the cross-departmental group include demands for services, the capacity to provide these, the development of an appropriate quality and standards framework, the development of criteria for the capital scheme, providing $3 million in support for after-school childcare services to be funded by my department as announced in Budget 2016. And in addition, the group will gather data, including the existing use of school buildings, and to consider collaborative models with existing community or private service providers. I'm also undertaking with my department consultations with children to identify what children like and dislike about after-school care, and to identify the places where children most likely to be cared for after school. And a report on that consultation will be submitted to me shortly, and I've asked the cross-departmental group to consider the voice of the child as part of those deliberations.
Deputy Smith.
Yeah, well, I welcome that, but I would like to reiterate that all the research shows that low-income families in this country in particular find it difficult to access childcare, and the average Irish family spends more than a quarter, that's 25% of their take-home pay on childcare, and that's twice what is averagely paid in the European Union. Now, my sister raised her 2 kids in Sweden, and the childcare facilities there were next to none, but it was all publicly run, publicly funded. You paid a little bit amount into it, but it was run by the local commune, and it was an excellent facility. And I think we had talk in the last government of moving to that kind of a model, because there are many problems with private childcare, and I don't know if you're aware of a strike at the moment in Kilcoole in County Wicklow in a privatised childcare facility called the National Childminding Association of Ireland, who are in receipt of €340,000 of your department's money annually, and are at the moment forcing redundancy on long-term staff between 8 and 15 years service, and are talking about replacing those staff. Now, to me, that's not redundancy. If you're getting rid of staff, it's because the jobs no longer exist, not to replace them. So I know this is not, I will ask you a direct question on that later, but I'm just using it to illustrate that problems can and do exist with private childcare providers, and we would love to see us move into a publicly provided model.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm in complete agreement with you, Deputy Smith, in relation that there are problems in both the private childcare setting as well as the community not-for-profit setting as well. Or and in that case, I mean, I think I would be aware, and I've done a lot of work in this area, obviously, over the years, that even in a community settings of provision of childcare, where there's public monies going in, it's still not enough for the people whose children need to be cared for necessarily to access completely publicly subsidized childcare, and that's why I suppose the very important start was in terms of the free preschool, and now moving to the additional weeks, which we call a second year, also provided in that context. But I think your question also raises for me absolutely the need for quality standards, which we are developing. Again, I think your question, particularly in relation to after-school care, and to allied to that, a way of monitoring and ensuring that those quality standards are implemented, and that those who don't do that I think will have to have answer for in terms of whether or not they can be in receipt of public money.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Daly.
Just to reiterate that I think we can all recognise, or at least we should by now see the evidence that the more we invest and the earlier we invest in our population, the greater the return at the other end. So it is really well worth the while of the state putting the resources into very young children in order to reap the benefits at the other end, where you find there's less problems with addiction or antisocial behaviour or in and out of jail terms, or indeed the ability to have well-rounded citizens who'll stand on their own 2 feet and will see through their education. And I think that need to invest in children when they're very, very young is absolutely crucial.
Agree with you more, and Deputy, and also in the context of my department, at least I'm delighted that the second largest spend in relation to the department after TUSLA is in developing a more sustainable, affordable, quality childcare, particularly prevention and early intervention. As I said, for the last 15 years professionally in my life, I've been a crusade and a campaigner for prevention and early intervention and encouraging that kind of investment. And as you know, and in relation to ABC or whatever programs, we've had to draw on philanthropic support in order to do this. We may not have that possibility, as much in the future. But that shouldn't stop and shouldn't present a barrier to ensure that there is still adequate investment, especially in those earlier years.
Thank you, Minister. I'm now moving on to question 5 in the name of Deputy